So now the next example we're going to talk about is Toys R Us, which I'm sure is just a nice little trip down memory lane. So in 2005, Toys R Us was acquired by a group led by Bain and KKR, which are two of the biggest private equity firms. And yeah, it was for a deal worth 6.6 billion USD. The buyout was heavily financed by debt on the company, up to approximately $400 million per year. So this is a high proportion of the company's EBITDA, so it was unsustainable. Next, the owners extracted over 470 million USD from fees like management and performance-based fees from Toys R Us. Finally, there was a sale and leaseback agreement, which basically meant that the owners sold all the real estate assets of Toys R Us and forced the company to have to buy and rent them back. Now, all of this ended up putting too much pressure on the finances of Toys R Us, and it unfortunately led to them going bankrupt and stores closing all around the world. Now, let's talk about how is private equity affected by global events. Well, I'm going to talk about the current market context as well as a few sort of black swan events that we've had recently. Now, the most important point here is inflation. Inflation has had the biggest impact on private equity because this led to uncertainty from investors because they don't know how much their returns are going to be worth. It's also shaped a number of government decisions and policies as well as like interest rates, and it's also just generally led to higher costs for private equity firms, which is it's bad for their operation. And yeah, same with everything else. It's just overall exposed vulnerabilities in some companies that are heavily financed by debt, as well as just generally reducing confidence and certainty. Now let's talk about how is private equity affected by government policies. So I'm going to talk about two countries here, the US and UK. US is the biggest market for private equity in the world and the most dominant, and the UK is obviously most relevant to us. Now just for some context, earlier this year, when Trump became president again, many people believed that would be good for private equity because they believed that he would have lower tax rates and some deregulation in some industries, which would be beneficial. So the first policy I'm going to talk about is the hawkish Fed, which all this means is that there's been high interest rates, which means less spending and less investment, so it's led to lower fundraising for private equity firms. Then there's tariffs. I don't feel like I need to explain this one. I mean, we've heard journalists ramble on about it the whole year. Now finally, this might be the most important point. The Trump administration wants to democratize access to private equity investments. So what this means is that they're going to make these investments accessible to everyone, like individual investors. And the way they're going to do this is by making it easier for workers to invest their 401k plans or their retirement plans into private equity. So this would be beneficial in a few ways because of all the reasons I talked about earlier about why private equity is attractive, but also because it leads to increased private capital. But there are a few negatives. For example, these public investors will need more regulation and sort of more reports. So that may end up making private equity turn into public equity, which is the very thing that's outperformed. So it may make private equity less efficient. So overall, hawkish Fed tariffs and democratization of private assets means that private equity may be sacrificing stability for scale. Now let's talk about a few of the UK's government policies. First is the carried interest tax reform, which just means that there's like approximately 28% tax on performance-based management fees. So this is negative for private equity. Next is the Mansion House reform, which basically means that defined contribution pension schemes will be encouraged to invest 5 to 10% into private equity. Next, there's the capital markets reform, which basically simplifies rules for IPOs, and this overall makes the UK more attractive for private equity investors. So that's also positive. Backstop powers on pension allocations it's not materialized yet. It's just proposed. But what it will mean is that there will be more pension allocations into private equity as well. Finally, the NSI Act of 2021, which mandated it made it mandatory for like 17 different industries to disclose any agreements. Like there are 17 like sensitive industries in the UK, like AI and security. And any transactions are now mandatory, which may be negative because it means that it puts foreign investors under even greater scrutiny. as well as adding regulatory risk. So now the conclusion. So private equity, there's been changing markets, which means that private equity needs to adapt. So there's been many challenges like higher interest rates, slower growth and exits, as well as rising scrutiny. Additionally, there may be convergence of private and public markets, which will make private equity less efficient. However, I don't think private equity is in trouble just yet because it's still outperforming public markets by a lot. And I think maybe in the long term, say 20, 25 years, it may be in trouble. So here's just a quick bibliography of the source I use. Wow. Thank you for listening.